everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. It's a pleasure to meet all of you and have a chance to speak with you. So how many of you have been in a situation where you intended to do something and then you just completely forgot to do it? Everybody, right? It's the worst too. It's always so terrible when that happens. I know I hate it. It drives me crazy when I forget to do stuff, especially important stuff that I want to do. And that particular type of memory is called prospective memory, which is remembering to remember. So it's not retrospective memory where you're just kind of sitting back and trying to remember like the capital of a state or something like that. It's a special type of memory where you have to remember to do something in the future. So you have some sort of intention that you want to fulfill, and your job is to try to remember to do that thing at the pre-specified time or after the specified event that you come across. So for instance, a failure in prospective memory, of course, is the movie Home Alone, where she left for vacation without one of her children. Right? She failed to remember to take all of her children on vacation with her. A pretty important prospective memory error, I would say, that she made there. So there's two different types of prospective memory. There's actually several different types, but I'm going to break it down from these two first. So there's time-based prospective memory. This is where you have to remember to do something at a pre-specified time. Right? So it's having to do something by 5 o'clock today. Or if you're trying to remember to take your medication, it's taking your medication at a pre-specified time of day. So maybe you take your medication every day at 8 o'clock in the morning. That's what a time-based prospective memory task is. The other type of prospective memory task is an event-based prospective memory task. And this is where you have to remember to do something after the presentation of a pre-specified event. So this is remembering to take your medication, for instance, after breakfast. Right? The event is eating breakfast, and that cues you to go ahead and take your medication. So you can have errors that take place both in time-based prospective memory and event-based prospective memory. And it turns out that time-based prospective memory is the one that's harder. It's easier to actually remember to do things after a specific event that you experience, and it's harder to do so at a pre-specified time. Another way that we can slice up prospective memory is to talk about it in terms of habitual prospective memory versus irregular prospective memory. Habitual prospective remembering is remembering to do stuff at the same time every week, for instance. It's something that is habit for you. So if you go to the store every day on Sunday, that is a habitual prospective memory task because you always do it at the same day every week. The irregular type of prospective memory is sort of one-off intention that you have to be able to remember to fulfill. So this is, for instance, if you went to the store on Sunday and you forgot to buy milk, so it's Wednesday or Thursday of that week, and you have to, just one time only go to the store to pick up milk on your way home from work. This type of memory is a lot more difficult. Right? It's easier to remember to do things if it's a habit, as opposed to remembering to do things if it's, something you're only doing once in a while. So I'm going to give you a couple of prospective memory tasks to complete during this talk here. I want to see how well all of you are able to prospectively remember something. So one thing I would like you to remember to do is clap when you see an animal. So if you see an animal at any time during my presentation, I want you to clap. Just one. Go ahead and clap for me. Exactly. Very good. So the other thing I'd like you to do is when it's 11 o'clock, when the clock strikes 11 o'clock, I want you to say the words tick-tock. Say tick-tock out loud. Very good. Nicely done. The other thing that I would like you to try to remember to do during this talk is to wave when you see lightning. So there's going to be a picture of lightning at some point in this talk, and when you see it, I want you to wave at me like this. Go ahead and wave at me. Awesome. Very good. I think you're going to do really well, but we'll see. So the way that I'm going to structure this talk is I'm going to explain what prospective memory is, and then we're going to talk about how prospective memory changes as you age and why it changes as you age. And then I'm going to try to give you some tips for improving your prospective memory to kind of combat some of those both age-related declines in prospective memory and also just general declines in prospective memory that everybody has. So let's start by saying why prospective memory is actually something that's worth studying. Of course, it's important to talk about things that actually matter. So let me take a second to give you reasons why it actually matters to study prospective memory. So more than half of the memory errors that we make on a daily basis are prospective memory errors. So when we have failures of our memory, most of the time it's because we forget to do something that we intended to do. That's the thing that we tend to make errors about the most. And regardless of how old you are or how well your cognitive functioning is, you're very like prospective memory errors. People forget to do about half of the things that they intend to do, which is pretty startling, really, that we're that bad at it. But we, in fact, are, regardless of what our station is in life. Bad prospective memory, of course, can lead to financial, physical, and professional peril. So, for instance, if you forget to pay your bills, it's going to be something that can affect you very much financially. If you forget to attend a meeting, for instance, at work, or you forget to meet a deadline at work, that can have impacts for your job professionally, of course. And then also, if you forget to take medications, or if you forget to do things that your doctors have asked you to do, then that can have consequences on your physical health as well. So bad prospective memory is also related to negative psychological outcomes. So people who have a lot of failures in their prospective memories tend to struggle with things like anxiety, which makes a lot of sense because you're afraid you're going to forget to do things in the future. So you're anxious about that happening on a daily basis. Another thing it can affect is your mood. So it can actually cause you to be more depressed if you have a lot of failures in your prospective memory. And it also can prevents you from feeling like you have the ability to complete the things that you set out to complete, which is called self-efficacy. You have sort of an inability to rely on yourself, which can impact your psychological well-being. And also, finally, prospective memory is important for independent living. So in order to live by yourself, you have to do things like remember to pay your bills, or remember to take your medications, or remember to feed your pets, and so forth. So it's important to be able to live on your own, that you can perform these prospective memory tasks. Okay, so I want to talk about, nice. I was wondering how many of you remember. Good job. That was like probably a third of you or so. Anyway, not too bad. So I'm going to go over some of the terminology for prospective memory. There's a few jargony types of terms that I'll use that I just want to make sure you understand what they mean. Hopefully they're not too challenging. So the first thing that you need to know about prospective memory is a prospective memory task, which is just the intention that you have. So it's you intending to go to the grocery store after you get off of work, or it's you intending to give a note to a friend the next time that you see them, etc. Within the prospective memory task, you have a prospective memory cue, which is the thing that tells you that you need to fulfill your intention. So this is, for instance, the time of day that you have to take your medication. Let's say you say that you're going to take your medication every day at 5 o'clock. When 5 o'clock rolls around, that's the cue for you to act on that intention and take your medication. And of course, after you notice the prospective memory cue, you have the prospective memory action, which is the actual intention that you are trying to fulfill. So this is remembering to stop at the store would be the action in that case. Remembering to go to the bank before it closes. That's the action itself. So another thing that's important to understand about prospective memory, and the thing that really separates it from other forms of memory, is that you aren't really cued naturally to remember something. So you have to actually remember to remember. Right? So you're doing things throughout the day that have nothing to do with your intentions, and you have to remember at the appropriate time to notice the cue and actually follow through on the prospective memory intention that you have. You have to disengage from the ongoing activities that are happening throughout your day. So, for instance, in all of the intentions that I gave you during the work on during this talk, what you're paying attention to for the most part is me talking to you about prospective memory. In order to actually clap when you see the animal, for instance, what you had to do was disengage from that ongoing task. of listening to me talk to you about prospective memory. And remember to complete the prospective memory action, which is clapping in this case. And the last term here is monitoring, which is sort of a fancy term for, it's actually not particularly fancy, but it's kind of another term for attention. So in order to actually notice the prospective memory cue, you have to sort of reserve some attention so that you can try to pick it out and detect it. So when you are able to notice that animal, for instance, it's because you were sort of monitoring, you're kind of waiting to see when that cue would come about. The same way that for those of you who will remember the time-based task that I gave you to at 11 o'clock say tick-tock, you're going to have to sort of continuously check the clock to make sure that you haven't missed the 11 o'clock time that I gave you to respond. So monitoring is the sort of attention that you pay so that you can detect the prospective memory cue. So the prospective memory process looks something like this. So in the first phase, you form your intention. So this is when you say to yourself or somebody says to you that you need to do something at some particular time or after you experience some sort of event. So for instance, maybe your intention is to remember to go to the bank before it closes at 5 p.m. to deposit a check. If that's your intention, then the first phase is to actually tell yourself or put in your mind somewhere that that's what you intend to do. The second step is to hold on to that intention. So this is where you keep that intention in your memory and don't forget it during the time that you need to remember to follow through on depositing the check. So you're not going to form this intention to do this and immediately go ahead and deposit the check. You have to, throughout your ongoing activities during the day, remember that if it's getting close to 5 o'clock, you have to remember to get to the bank to deposit the check. You have to retain that intention during that process. The third step is the intention initiation phase. So this is where you actually notice the prospective memory cue and perform the prospective memory action. It's your ability to detect that cue. It was when you're able to recognize the animal that I told you to look out for. And then finally, there's the intention execution phase, and this is where you actually follow through on the intention. This is where you actually remember to take the medication or to go to the store or to deposit the check, etc. Now, you can have prospective memory errors that happen at each stage of this process, and they're going to have different implications for your ability to remember what you intend to do. So you can have errors that take place during the intention formation and retention phase. So you can fail to encode the intention itself. The best example of this is when your significant other tells you to do something and you just simply didn't listen to them. That's something that's pretty common, of course, but that means that you just did not pay attention to the actual intention and never formed it in the first place. The other thing that could happen is during the retention phase, you could forget either the prospective memory cue or the prospective memory action. So if that happens, then you may remember what to do. So you might remember what the action is and not remember when you're supposed to do it. So this would be like you remember you have to deposit the check, but you don't remember when the bank closes. So it would be an example of this. The other thing that can happen is you can remember when to do something, but you can forget what you have to do. So this is always fun, right? Where you're sitting there thinking about, I had to do something today by 5 o'clock, and I don't know what it is. You can also forget both of these too, is another thing that can happen. That's when you wake up tomorrow morning and you say to yourself, I was supposed to go to the bank yesterday, and you just never did it. So these are obviously very common errors in prospective memory that happen during these two phases. There's also errors that take place in the initiation and execution phase of prospective memory. So these are the most common forms of prospective memory errors. It's the ones that everybody makes and you're most likely to make. And most of the time, it's because you missed the prospective memory cue. It's not that you forgot what you had to do. It's not that you forgot when you had to do it. It's just that you missed the cue when it happened. So you missed 5 o'clock. You just forgot to monitor for 5 o'clock happening, and it went by before you could actually do anything about depositing the check. If it's a event-based prospective memory cue that you have to remember, then maybe you saw your friend and you had a conversation with your friend and you still completely forgot to tell them what you intended to tell them. So this is the most common form of prospective memory. Probably for most of you who forgot to clap when you saw the animal, this is what happened, right? You probably just missed the animal there, like you just weren't looking out for it. That's this type of error here. So let's transition now into talking about how memory changes as you age. And first, I just want to talk about some general cognitive changes that happen for you as you get older. So first of all, the part of your brain that's mostly affected by aging is what's called your frontal lobe. So this is the front part of your brain here. It's like a person standing like this. So it's this front part of somebody's brain. That's the part of your brain that tends to be affected the most with aging. And there's a couple of different things that happen as you get older. You actually lose brain matter in that area. So you start to lose density in your brain, in your frontal lobe. And by the way, your frontal lobe is responsible for all sorts of things, including attention, including executive function, which is your ability to sort of problem solve and switch between cognitive tasks. It has to do with your ability to think quickly. So as your frontal lobe starts to lose density and lose connections, you'll start to process things slower and so forth. So all of these types of functions are sort of affected by this change in your brain that happens as you age. The other thing that happens, and the most important thing that happens, is you start to lose connections between your brain cells. So your brain cells are all connected to each other, and less substantial than the actual brain cells disappearing is the connections between the brain cells disappearing. And that's what starts to happen, especially after you get over the age of 65 or so. So how does this affect the functioning of your brain? So how does it affect the tasks that you complete on a daily basis? Well, it has implications for how fast you're able to process information. So one of the things that people notice the most as they get older is that they're just not as sharp as they used to be. It feels like it takes longer to think about things. And that's one of the things that happens because of the changes in your frontal lobe. Another thing that happens is your attention declines. So your ability to focus on things, your ability to pay attention when somebody's talking to you, for instance, or to notice things that you might have noticed otherwise. Maybe you were somebody that was very observant when you were younger, but as you get older, you start to feel like you're not noticing things as much. These are the types of things that decline as well with age because of the changes in your brain. Also, your cognitive flexibility declines, so your ability to switch between thinking about different things is something that slows down a little bit as you age. So you're not able to like multitask as much as you otherwise were able to. And then with memory, you have some things that get worse and some things that actually don't change at all as you age. So let me show you what those things are. So the things about memory that tend to decline with your age are recalling information without anybody cueing you for that information. So for instance, if you go to the store and you try to memorize the list of items that you need to pick up, you're going to be less likely to remember all of those items. That's something that's going to be affected by aging. Another thing is remembering the source of memories. So you start to have trouble remembering where you learned information, or who told you something is another thing that starts to kind of get a little foggy as you get older. And then finally, your prospective memory is definitely affected by age. So your ability to remember, to do things in the future, to remember is affected. And it makes a lot of sense that it is, because all of those cognitive functions I told you about a second ago are related to prospective memory performance.
You're just full of it.
I am. I'm just, I'm oozing with good news. So I actually do have some good news here, though. So there are parts of your memory that don't decline with age. There's parts of your memory that never will decline, and unless you have some sort of neurodegenerative disease like dementia or Alzheimer's. But if not, then these parts of your memory stay stable pretty much throughout your entire life. So you remember information with a cue. really well. So if I were to ask you whether or not you've ever been to Disney World, you could answer that question just as well as an older adult as you could as a younger adult. You don't forget information like that if I cue you for it. The other thing that doesn't really change is your ability to just remember the timeline of events. So your ability to just remember the things that have happened to you throughout your life don't really go away. You're able to remember all of those things just as well as you ever were as you age. Another thing too is your ability to remember how to do things. This is the most stable form of memory, generally speaking. It's something that never goes away with age. So you won't forget like how to sew, or you won't forget like how to ride a bike. You won't forget how to do things that you otherwise knew how to do. You may be less likely to be able to actually do those things, but you don't forget how to do them. Sure. So let's talk specifically now about aging and prospective memory, where we can look at the specific part of the prospective memory process that is affected by aging. So prospective memory errors increase with age, especially after the age of 65. They tend to increase by about 20 to 50% or so. So you start to forget to do things you intend to do pretty frequently, which can be a little bit overwhelming. And the declines seem to be caused by specific aspects of the prospective memory process. So let's talk about what those are. During the intention formation phase, it's one of the phases where your ability to enact prospective memories declines the most. So just your ability to form the intention in the first place is going to be influenced by age. So you're going to be not as good at like elaboratively thinking about the thing that you need to remember to do, so you're going to be less likely to remember to do it. The other thing that declines with age is your ability to actually notice the prospective memory cue. So you're going to have decreased attentional abilities, which is going to influence your ability to monitor and notice those cues that tell you that you need to perform the action that you intended to perform. So you're going to miss the time period, for instance, where you needed to take your medication, or you're going to miss the closing hours for the bank you needed to stop by to deposit a check. You're just not going to notice that it was that time of day. And so, like I said, this seems to be because your ability to pay attention to things just generally declines a little bit as you age. And it's also the case that you get worse at irregular prospective memory tasks. People are generally worse at these tasks, but you get more worse at these kinds of tasks as you age. So your ability to remember to do these one-off things, intentions that you have, like to tell some sort of message to a friend when you see them, for instance, isn't something you do all the time or habitually. So it's something you're going to be more likely to forget to do. Having to stop by the store on your way home from work to pick up milk or something like that is another thing that you're going to be less likely to remember to do because you just don't do it every week or every day, etc. And also, as you become worse at prospective memory, you start to feel anxious about your prospective memory, and that in turn makes you do worse at remembering things because you're anxious about it. The anxiety can influence your ability to pay attention. So there's this really vicious cycle that can take place. As you start to forget things more, you might then, after that, forget even more things because you're worried about forgetting things, which is great. So how can we combat these age-related declines in prospective memory? The good news is there's a ton of ways to do so, and a lot of them are very effective. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you what some of those are, some of the tips that I have for you in improving your prospective memory performance. So there's a couple of different ways that you can approach this problem. So you can actually try to reverse the age-related declines themselves. Right? So you can essentially treat the cause rather than treating the symptoms of prospective memory. And there are effective ways to do this. And this is what's called a process-based intervention. The other way that you can go about intervening with prospective memory or improving your prospective memory is what's called strategy-based interventions. And this is where you try to compensate for your lack of prospective memory. So you use resources or tools to be able to make up for the fact that you can't remember to do things. And I'm talking about this in the context of aging, but it applies to everyone, no matter what your age is, because your perspective memory just kind of sucks, generally speaking, regardless of how old you are. So all of these things help, regardless of how old you are, too. First thing that I want to mention is something that really doesn't help all that much, ironically. So there's sort of a big craze right now in using these types of these brain game kind of tasks. So things like Lumosity, for instance, Peak is another one, where they have you play games that are supposed to increase your cognitive performance. Unfortunately, the literature, the science on these interventions is not really all that good to this point. It's still really young, so it's possible that these types of games have more effect than we know at this point. But right now, the research suggests that they're not particularly effective. And the reason why they're not effective, it seems, is because you basically get good at the game that you are playing that's supposed to be related to something like attention or supposed to be related to something like memory, but it doesn't really transfer to those things generally speaking. So you'll get better at playing some specific memory game, but it's not going to necessarily improve your memory overall. It just makes you kind of better at playing that game. That's true for most of these games for these types of services that are provided. They are really effective for evaluating your cognitive performance. So there are apps, for instance, like Peak, that will show you where your performance is among people of your age and gender and some of those characteristics. And that's pretty good. It actually can be a good way of evaluating things like attention, memory, etc. But training you on how to become better at those games doesn't necessarily mean that it improves those skills overall, if that makes sense. At least that's what the research is kind of showing so far. And the thing that I want to caution you for sure is to never trust a company that tells you that you can improve your intelligence by doing these things. That's almost certainly not a true claim. Really, one of the only ways to improve your intelligence is to learn stuff, believe it or not. You can't really necessarily play these games that are supposed to increase like attention and memory and things like that and expect to become more intelligent necessarily. So let's go ahead. Oh yes, you remember to wait. That's great. I forgot. Well, that was another like third of you that remembered. That's pretty good. Don't even remember my own perspective memory task I give you to do. So there are some process-based strategies that are effective for improving your perspective memory. And nice. A lot of people remember that one. That's good. Did somebody set a reminder? That's cheating. Come on, you can't do that. I'm sure it is your lunch alarm. So one of the process-based strategies that seems to be pretty effective for increasing your perspective memory abilities is mindfulness meditation. Does anybody practice mindfulness meditation? A few of you do. It is really effective for a lot of things, actually. What it is meditation that is meant to increase your awareness. So this could be increasing your awareness of sounds that you're hearing, increasing your awareness of thoughts that you're having, your awareness of your environment, etc. It's pretty much just becoming a passive observer of the things that you're experiencing. The basic tenet of mindfulness meditation. And it can be as simple as just paying attention to your breath. So just breathing and paying attention to nothing but your breath is the most rudimentary way to do mindfulness meditation. But there's all sorts of different ways that you can do it, and there's all sorts of different resources that are available. That reminds me, I had a handout for you that I'm not going to forget to give to you. Don't let me forget to give you this handout. Yeah. Yeah, yoga definitely has some mindfulness characteristics to it. Yeah, it definitely has a lot of the same benefits as mindfulness meditation. And it really has a lot to do with just kind of retraining your attention, is what it really does for the most part. And it has a ton of cognitive benefits. So in the packets that or not packets, but in the papers I have for you, I have some links to some websites that provide both sort of a beginner's guide for mindfulness meditation and some resources. So some of the better apps that you can use, or some of the better books that are available for it. So I will not forget to give those to you. Don't let me forget, at least. There's a reason why I study perspective memory, because mine is terrible. The many cognitive benefits that come along with mindfulness meditation include increased memory performance. So across the board, your memory tends to be better if you practice this. Your processing speed, which is something that does decline with age, is something you can gain back a little bit with mindfulness meditation. You can actually kind of give yourself a little bit of headspace that will increase your ability to think about things quicker. The other thing, of course, is attention, which is naturally something that improves, because that's mostly what mindfulness meditation is about, is changing the way that you pay attention to things. And there's also emotional benefits. So mindfulness meditation can help with things like anxiety and depression, for instance. So both your mood and your anxiety can be decreased by practicing mindfulness meditation, which will also in turn help you sleep better, which is also another benefit of it. And all of those things kind of come back and affect your perspective memory performance. So it's one of the more effective general process-based ways to actually increase your perspective memory performance. The other one is something that I'm not certainly the only person telling you should do, which is just good health in general is going to be very important psychologically for you. So you think about health as being something that affects you physically, and that's true. I'm sure that everybody's doctor is telling them to get enough sleep and exercise and eat well. But it also has a ton of psychological benefits. It pretty much has across the board psychological benefits. So if you have bad physical health, it'll affect your ability to remember things, your ability to plan for things, attend to things, so forth and so on.
Do you recommend one diet versus another, like Mediterranean diet, or Mediterranean diet versus a meat diet, or?
It's a good question, but it's a good question, but unfortunately, I'm not a medical doctor, so I don't have any recommendations diet-wise or medication-wise. But those are two things that can also be very effective. I just don't have the expertise to advise on them, unfortunately. But it's a good question for sure. So let's move on to the. I love putting puns just for my own enjoyment inside of my presentations. But for the strategy-based interventions, there's also a few ways that have been shown pretty consistently to improve your perspective memory performance. The most effective way that you can get better at remembering to do things is to keep calendars, planners, and reminders. And you want to keep these in such a way that you adhere to them pretty strictly. So they don't really do you a whole lot of good if you're not using them. So you want to make sure that you're regularly checking them and updating them consistently, almost religiously is what I have to do in order to remember to do anything. And there's a ton of resources available for calendars these days. How many people have a Yeah, almost everybody does. So it's okay to use both, in like paper calendars can be really effective. In some ways more effective than digital calendars. And digital calendars can also be very effective. The one added benefit of digital calendars is you can set reminders in them. So if you are trying to remember an irregular perspective memory task, especially if you put a reminder inside of your calendar so that your phone beeps and tells you to remember to pick up the laundry or something like that. And that can be really effective for actually remembering to pick up the laundry, of course. Of course, the digital reminders are not the only reminders that you can have for yourself. So there's very effective other types of reminders. How many people use like sticky notes, for instance? You do. That's something that's really commonly used and also very effective. Another thing is a whiteboard. Does anybody have like a whiteboard where they put stuff on it? You do. Yeah, that can be really effective too. So there's all sorts of ways that you can personalize your calendar and planner experience. But the most important thing is that you find a way to just make sure that you're keeping up to date with it and that you're checking it regularly. It's also important to take regular breaks throughout the day to check your calendar. So there's a couple of reasons why this is important. So this is important, first of all, because you're not going to remember to do things on your calendar if you don't look at your calendar, which is something that happens to me all the time where I just fail to look at the calendar, and if I would have remembered to do what I intended to do. The other thing is that research shows that if you disengage from an ongoing task, so if you just kind of take a break with what you're doing throughout the day and do nothing for a couple of minutes, some of the things that you intend to remember will just come to mind when you do that. Because remember, one of the most prominent ways that you forget to do things is by not noticing the cue that you need to pay attention to. So by taking breaks, you're giving yourself the sort of headspace to actually pay attention to those cues coming up. So taking breaks throughout the day can be a really effective way to remember to do things in the future, especially if you use that time to check your calendar. Finally, it's good to use really distinctive reminders. So it doesn't really do you any good if you have a reminder that you don't notice, right? Or if you have a reminder to do something, for instance. So if you have a reminder that I have a reminder on my phone that tells me to check my to-do list, and it goes off at the same time every day. And I used to set it at like 1 o'clock in the afternoon. It was right at the time where I was always doing something else, like I was something that I couldn't disengage from. So it was just completely worthless reminder. So you want to make sure that you set your reminder up in such a way that you will actually notice it and you will actually have the time to do what you have set out to do. If you're using physical reminders, some really good ways to make your reminders really distinctive is to use colorful reminders, for instance. Another thing that's really effective is to put reminders in weird places. So this is especially useful for your significant others if you're trying to remind them to do things. You can put their reminder like on the door as they're leaving, or you can put it on the handle of their car, for instance, things like this, where it's just going to kind of slap you in the face that thing is there. You can't possibly miss it. Those are some of the ways that you can make the reminders, which are already effective, even more effective. Okay, so the final strategy that I have for you here that's also extraordinarily effective is what's called an implementation intention. This is sort of a newer concept in psychology, and it was originally conceived as a way of helping people fulfill goals. So not even just remember to fulfill goals, but to actually follow through on achieving goals that people set out for themselves. And of course, one of the very important aspects of achieving a goal is remembering to do it, right? So these implementation intentions tend to be really useful for being able to remember your prospective memory tasks as well. And basically what they are is you take your intention and you turn it into an if-then statement. So if, for instance, you're trying to remember to go to the bank before it closes, then you can say, if it is before 5 o'clock, then I will go to the bank. Right? So you put it in this particular structure here that allows you to kind of have it in front of you and really pay attention to the if-then characteristics of the intention that you're trying to remember. And then from there, it's very important to be specific about what you're going to do and when. Right? So if you're trying to remember to take medication, for instance, after you eat breakfast, then you want to be very specific about how you're going to do that. So you're going to say something along the lines of, if I take my cereal out of the bowl and pour it into a bowl and eat it, and then what I have to do is I have to go and get my medication out of the medication drawer, take it out, grab a glass of water and fill it with water, etc. You want to be very specific about exactly what you're going to do when you fulfill that intention. And then you can even make the implementation intention stronger by doing things like visualizing yourself doing the prospective memory task, sort of running through it in your head, what exactly it'll be like. Another thing that you can do as well that's even more effective is to actually act it out if you can. So if you can go through the motions of actually all the things that you intend to do, then it's going to be the case that you not only remember to do it, but you will likely not miss the prospective memory cues that tell you that it's time to do that thing. And this is particularly important for aging because one of the processes, part of the prospective memory process that's affected by aging is, of course, your ability to form the intention in the first place. And that's exactly what this intervention is aimed at, is increasing your ability to form that intention in a way that you'll actually remember it later. Okay, so very good. Nice. A lot of you remember that one. That's great. So, of course, I gave you a prospective memory task to do today. How well did you all do on it? How many people got all 3 of them done? A couple people did? A few people? How many 2 of the 3 of them? Yeah, it looks like maybe half of you. And how many 1 of them?
There was 4. I got 3 out of 4.
That's true, yeah. So there's technically 4. Yeah. 3 out of 4 is pretty good. I would have taken 3 out of 3 too, just remembering 1 of the animal times would have been fine too. Yeah. Yeah. Where people said it. Yeah, where you like, yeah. No, it's so easy to miss them. It really is. So the question I have for you now is, how could you have done better? How could you have been more likely to have fulfilled the intentions that I gave you? Exactly. Yeah. If you would have put it in your calendar, that would have definitely helped. Right. So you weren't actually paying attention when stuff happened. Yeah.
Well, I stopped worrying about it after the first
day. Okay. And it's interesting too. One of the things I should have pointed out in this presentation is that you have a better memory for unfulfilled intentions. So if you start to partially fulfill an intention, then you're going to be really likely to remember to finish it. You have like this almost anxiety that you get about being partially done with something. So a really good way too, if you're trying to remember to do something that it maybe has a bunch of subtasks as a part of it, is to just start it, and then you're going to be more likely to just have that anxiety that exists until you actually do it. So it's another really effective way to remember to do things. Really quick here, and if there's any more time for questions, I'll answer them for you. So perspective memory is important. It's something that affects everyday life, more so than any other type of memory does. It declines with age, especially attention, flexibility, and your memory in certain ways, even though there's aspects of your memory that remain pretty stable as you age too. Health and meditation are really important process-based interventions. So these are 2 things that can really help you maintain some of your cognitive functioning as you age. It's also something that can help you regardless of whether or not you're aging. For those of you who aren't aging, I don't know, maybe some of you exist. I don't know. Find the fountain of somebody found the fountain of youth, maybe. So the other thing that's effective is calendars and reminders. So this is the most effective strategy-based intervention that you can use to combat prospective memory failures. And then implementation intentions are also really useful. So this is where you make that if-then statement and focus on the specifics of the intention that you wish to fulfill. That's something that can be very effective, both for people who are aging and people who are younger, older adults and younger adults. And thank you very much for your time and your attention.